Episode 3 of Chernobyl continued on directly where the second episode concluded, which was with the three men, Ignatenko, Bespalov and Baranov, going to the reactor forum with the hopes of draining the steam suppression pools. Whilst being immersed within darkness and the piercing sound of the device that they had causing the sense of hearing to be significantly louder than what was visible in sight, the tone and mood of this haunting, harrowing and devastating episode that had its small triumphs was set. With us seeing how the Chernobyl disaster was beginning to claim some of the lives of the people that were there when it first went off, this episode showed just how devastating the consequences of it were gonna be, and how even though the fire had been put out, it was now the long-term problems that needed to be solved. So with that, let's break down the episode, compare the show to the true events, and discuss all things Chernobyl Episode 3. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. I actually think for this video it might be best to break it down by the different characters, as there were so many arcs that were going on in this one. But first, let's start by discussing the opening scene. This opening scene was so immersive, frightening, and also inspiring. The three men were navigating the maze, which was the room which contained Reactor 4, and we could barely see anything, just like what they were experiencing. All we heard was the clicking of the device and the heavy breaths and muffled speaking that they were doing. The noise just kept getting louder and it felt like the room kept getting darker. Pairing that with Scherbina and Legasov being in conversation and stating that the men could in fact be dead by now, and if they were, then there was no plan B. It showed just how high the stakes were. However, they didn't need to doubt them. All three men, Ignatenko, Bespalov and Baranov, successfully completed the mission and were crucial in preventing the thermal explosion from taking place. The prediction that was made was that all three of those men would die not long after going into the room, but as of 2019, two of them were still alive. Ignatenko and Bespalov were still alive in 2019, but Baranov is no longer here. He died in 2005 at the age of 65. In the time period of the disaster, what those men went through was quickly forgotten. But in 2019, all three of them were awarded Hero of Ukraine titles, and Ignatenko was awarded the Order for Courage in 2018. Khomyuk. Khomyuk had an interesting role in this episode, and as we discussed in the previous video, she's not actually a real person. She's a fictitious character that represented the team that was working alongside Legasov in all of the work that he did in uncovering the truth, and also looking to solve the issues. This episode saw her investigating how the explosion actually occurred, because by her calculations, it didn't seem possible for it to have happened the way that it did. This led her to go to Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, and she then interviewed Leonid Toptunov, who was the Senior Research Chief Engineer, and also Asimov, two characters that we previously saw in Episode 1 of the show trying to deal with the explosion following it occurring. What we saw when she laid eyes on Toptunov was nothing short of nightmare-inducing, and it was simply heartbreaking seeing this 25-year-old lying there in absolute pain as he was slowly dying. Dying in what you could imagine was a torturous way. When Khomyuk went to visit Asimov, we didn't actually see the character's face. This is because it was later described by her in the episode as it pretty much being blackened and gone. The severity of his injuries were made known to us by the way that Khomyuk responded, and the shock and taken-back nature that was in her eyes. Within real life, it was said that Asimov's face was decomposed, and it was almost like somebody had peeled back the skin. It was also said that his skull was visible too. I can definitely see why the director made the decision to not show the condition that Asimov was in, because it would have been utterly horrific. It's actually said that they didn't even shoot a version of that scene where Asimov was in frame. It was always supposed to be hidden. I feel like this was because over the course of the episode, we saw people's conditions getting worse. For example, we saw Toptunov in a frail state. Then we saw the gradual deterioration of Vasily until he ended up at a point where it looked worse than Leonid, and almost like a corpse. So it was almost like our imagination would do the work for us with Asimov, and you could argue that trying to depict what somebody looked like in their final moments could have been exploitative, especially when it's something so graphic. During the interviews that she carried out, she questioned whether or not the AZ5 button was pressed, and in hearing that it was pressed before the explosion from Leonid, it made her realize that it could have been something that might have actually triggered the explosion, and it's something that's going to tie into the nuclear reactor design flaw that herself and Legasov are going to be looking into in the remaining episodes of the show. Khomyuk actually pulled Lyudmila away from Vasily, and she ended up being arrested by the KGB for saying that everybody was going to hear about this. This tied into what we saw earlier on in the episode, where both Legasov and Scherbina were being followed, highlighting that even though they were being trusted to work, they didn't have free rein to do what they wanted, showing that the spread of misinformation was something that was being taken very seriously. It took Legasov confronting Viktor Charkov, who was chairman of the KGB, to get Khomyuk released from jail. Lyudmila and Vasily. This part of the episode was one which allowed us to see the true effects of the victims of the blast, more specifically Vasily Ignatenko, the firefighter that we last properly saw in episode 1 of the show. Lyudmila went to hospital number 6 in Moscow with the hopes of seeing her husband, and she was told on several occasions that she couldn't see him, nor should she be around him. But through the passion, desire, and will that she had to see him, she paid off the receptionist to get through. To our surprise and also hers, when Lyudmila opened the door, Vasily was there socializing, around his colleagues, playing cards, and even smoking, showing that it looked like he could well pull through it. Vasily was in the stage that Legasov spoke about, called "Everything Seems Fine and It Will Be Like You're Recovering," when he was asked to describe to Comrade Scherbina about what would happen to the men that were there following acute radiation syndrome. Vasily looked like he had burns and he was sore, but that was about it. It looked painful, but not like he was going to die. Honestly, nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared us for what would happen to Vasily, how quickly he would deteriorate, and the condition that he'd be left in at the end of the episode. The moment that Lyudmila and Vasily hugged each other after she was told not to touch him, the slow motion effect and the sound effect that started playing in the background, almost mirroring the sound of the explosion and transitioning into the men in masks, felt like it was insinuating that terrible times were on the horizon, and it was almost foreshadowing a damning fate for either him or the both of them. When Lyudmila was sleeping during the evening, mere hours after she saw him, she awoke to screaming by her husband, and when she looked down at him, his condition had gotten extremely worse, to the point where he was beginning to look unrecognizable, but it was only later on where we saw that she realized that he wasn't going to make it through. He had always promised her that he'd take her to Moscow, and by chance the hospital that they were in was there because they had a specialized radiological department there. Due to his eyes being sensitive to the light, he asked her to tell him the view from the window, where she lied about what was nearby, saying how she could see the Red Square and the Kremlin, when in reality, all it was the side of a white building. I feel like this was done to give him a nicer image of the location where he'd be spending his final moments, rather than the reality of a white wall. The tear that she had showed just how much she loved him and that the mourning process had already begun. The work and effort that she went through to even be in the same room as him was testament to the love that she had for him, and it was simply admirable. Lyudmila was asked if she was pregnant before going to see him, which she said that she wasn't. But when Vasily was in his final moments and in the condition that was so upsetting to look at, where his skin looked like it had simply melted away, she told him that she was carrying their child. During this scene, I just sat there and thought, you poor man. He had his whole life ahead of him, a family that was on the way, and his life was now on the cusp of being over, and being over in the most horrific and painful of ways. The acute radiation syndrome had taken a hold of him, and we saw that he passed away at the end of the episode, which was then followed by us seeing his funeral alongside other Chernobyl victims. He was buried in a coffin made of wood and also zinc, which was welded together, and then buried in cement. This was done so that it would block the high levels of radiation that contaminated him and the other individuals that were buried there. What we didn't see in the show was that whilst Vasily was in hospital, he was actually given a bone marrow transplant on the 2nd of May from his older sister being the donor. This was done because it was hoped that the procedure would raise his white blood cell count, which was lowered following the exposure to the radiation. However, it proved to be unsuccessful. The final scene where we saw Lyudmila standing over his grave as the cement was being poured over the coffins was just heartbreaking. The episode concluded when his coffin was fully covered, and it being paired with a close-up shot of Lyudmila in tears watching on was a painful reminder of the innocence that was taken away, the horrific nature of the death, and how quickly it all happened, especially when it seemed like he was getting better. Legasov and Scherbina. Legasov and Scherbina took a bit more of a backseat role in this episode, but this was purely because we spent a lot of time with the Ignatenkos and also Khomyuk as we explored their time in Moscow. What we saw with Legasov and Scherbina was them looking to neutralize the fire that was present in Chernobyl, and then, once that was done, the then possibility and option of overcoming the issue where the reactor fuel was going to be sinking into the ground. This oncoming issue meant that they needed to build a heat exchanger underneath the concrete pad. This was because if the nuclear fuel seeped into the ground, then the river Pripyat could be compromised, and it would then impact the water supply of 50 million people. Something which would impact their ability to access fresh water, but also the crops that were growing in farms too, so it needed to be done. This was where we were then taken to Tula, where we saw Glokov and his team of miners as they were requested to go to Chernobyl with the hopes of building this heat exchanger underneath the ground. What I liked about this scene where Glokov and his men were recruited was that they all wanted a bit of honesty. They were willing to do their bit for their country and the people within it if it were possible, but they didn't want to be taken advantage of, and he simply just wanted to know where his men were going. This was an attitude and behavior that was carried throughout the entirety of the episode. As we saw when he took Legasov's cigarettes, when he wanted to know the truth about if the masks actually protected him and his men, if they'd all be taken care of after this was done, what the damage would be to them, and also demanding fans because it was too hot down there, 50 degrees to be precise. We even saw them mining the old-fashioned way, like their fathers did, due to not being able to get fans because of the dangerous radiation levels that would be in the dust that they'd end up breathing in. We saw that Legasov had an issue with the fact that the evacuation zone was only 30 kilometers and not 200 kilometers. This was something that he vocalized, but was overlooked when on the phone. It was more so towards the end of the episode where we saw the best of Harris as Legasov. This was as he was speaking with Khomyuk, and he said how he was done with it all. The death sentences that he was bestowing on people was something that was weighing heavy on his mind, and by him also saying that animals needed to be killed, all rocks, trees, and ground would need to be destroyed and then buried underneath it, and also with 100 square kilometers of ground and forest needing to be razored down. This was a total annihilation of the area of not only human life, but life as we know it in general, showing just how devastating the effects were. This was a project that would take 3 years and around 750,000 people to make it happen, which would still result in thousands or even tens of thousands of deaths. Something that he was feeling the weight of. He was handing out death sentences for people that he didn't even know and hadn't even been assigned them yet. There was a painting that got a heavy focus in the moments before Legasov went in to discuss what the next steps were going to be, and it felt like this was an image that really focused on the pain, loss, and suffering that we saw taking place in the episode, the loved ones that had passed away and the families that would be in mourning in the future due to what was on the horizon. With the sea of people being recruited at the end of the episode, it showed that the tragedy was far from over and it was still going to touch so many people's lives. My review of the episode. I thought this was a very strong episode of the show. This felt like an episode that really leaned into the pain, suffering, and damage that the disaster caused, and the implications that it had on not only the people that were involved and were working there, but also the people that weren't directly involved at all. For example, the miners, the firefighters, the civilians, and also the people that were set to be recruited. I'd also say that this was an episode that heavily leaned into the nightmarish side of the disaster, with the way that the exposure to the radiation was impacting the people. It was so haunting, and the sight of Toptunov was just in my head long after the episode concluded. With an episode that started in darkness, it finished in darkness too, but the darkness of the cement as the bodies were buried in the double-layered coffins. It was a theme that was appropriate due to the tone of the episode and the themes that it was exploring. I actually think that out of the first 3 episodes, this one could be my favourite. I feel it gets across the horrors of what happened. We heard about the long-lasting impact that it's going to have in the land not being habitable for tens of thousands of years. And we also saw the emotions as we witnessed people having to say goodbye to loved ones, when only a few days ago they were leading normal lives. Witnessing how fast acute radiation syndrome can kill a person and the horrifying things that it does in giving false hope is just cruel. Making a human unrecognizable and giving them pain to the point where morphine can't ease it. It sounds like one of the worst ways to go, and this show got that across. Seeing Asimov and Toptunov in the first episode and then seeing them not even resembling what we know as a human was just so upsetting. The line that the doctor said to Ludmilla in response to her saying, "He's my husband," where she said, "Not anymore, he's not. He's something else. He's dangerous to you." It gave me intrigue as to what he would be like, but nothing could have prepared me at all. This episode was all about providing shock, and it did that and some. One thing that I quite enjoyed seeing in this episode was Legasov and Scherbina's relationship starting to improve, and them actually seeing value in each other, more so on Scherbina's side. In terms of performances, I actually feel like Emily Watson and Jessie Buckley stole it. The facial expressions that they emitted due to the emotions that they were feeling were just so convincing, and I couldn't take my eyes off either of them. They really did take this one. One thing that I would say has started to jar me now that we're 3 episodes deep into the show is the accents. Obviously, it's not done in its native language due to a lot of the actors being British, Irish, American, or Swedish. However, sometimes you've got an actor putting on a Russian accent, and other times you've got a Northern English accent. It just doesn't quite make sense to me. There's no consistency, and I wish they either said everybody does an accent or nobody does one. It's my one critique of the show. With the next episode being called The Happiness of All Mankind, I'm excited to cover this one, and I'll be dropping the video over the next 10 days, so be sure to keep your eyes peeled. So, there you have it, a breakdown and the ending explained of Chernobyl Episode 3. If you want to see the episodes of Chernobyl being broken down, then be sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss when I post the next one. Plus, if you want to see episodes 1 and 2 being broken down, then click on the card in the top corner. There'll be a playlist there with the videos. What did you think of episode 3? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.